who was definitely here a moment ago.
Still here.
Excellent. So Ryne, if you're able to set up your PowerPoint to present to us today, we are going to hear on the overconfidence in versional citations in the Greek New Testament using the Syriac Peshitta version of Colossians as a test case. So we can see your PowerPoint, it's displaying properly, and over to you. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Professor Houghton, for setting this all up and for giving me this opportunity to share my research. The introduction to the 28th edition of the Nestle Aland Novum Testamentum Graeci claims that versions are cited only where their underlying Greek text can be determined with confidence. However, there is evidence to suggest that the NA28 has been overconfident in some of its versional citations. Most users of editions like the NA28 are completely reliant on the text critical work that shapes not only the critical apparatus, but even the eclectic text itself. So refining our methods and improving the accuracy of critical notes is a worthwhile pursuit. A small but nevertheless important part of that is the citation of ancient versions. If versional evidence is to be employed properly for textual criticism, there must be a thorough understanding of each version's transmission and translation. But in the case of the Syriac versions, the latter of these two is largely unsatisfactory. Peter Williams has demonstrated as much in his study on Syriac translation technique in the Gospels, in which he argues that early Syriac witnesses of the Gospels do not support many of the Greek variants that they have been claimed to support. Before the publication of the NA28, Williams observed that the Institute at Münster has judged the collection and collation of Syriac witnesses to be methodologically prior to its systematic evaluation by studies in translation technique. That said, thanks to the editions of the Peshitta epistles produced under the auspices of the Institute, we are now in a position to evaluate and refine the use of the Syriac witnesses presented to us in the apparatus of the NA27. In a subsequent review of the NA28, Williams acknowledged an improvement in its versional citations, but also noted several places where versions are cited when their witness is actually ambiguous. Thus, he concludes, there is still a substantial work to carry out on the translation technique of the early versions and its relationship to textual criticism. This paper is the product of research that takes up this work for the Peshitta version of Colossians. Colossians was chosen for two reasons. First, in general, there is a lack of published research regarding Syriac translation technique and its bearing on the textual criticism of the Greek New Testament outside of the Gospels. Aside from Peter Williams's article on the citations of the Peshitta in the NA27 text of Romans, only minimal attention has been given to the Syriac translations of the epistles as witnesses to their Greek texts. The second reason for choosing Colossians specifically is its inclusion in the next volume of the Editio Critica Maior. This research will hopefully contribute to that project by clarifying the place of the Peshitta in the critical apparatus. Here, I offer a brief tour of my research on the Peshitta text of Colossians to determine how its translation technique influences its witness to the underlying Greek text, followed by an evaluation of a few spurious citations in the critical apparatus of the NA28. Finally, I will offer some reflections on the citation of versional evidence in the textual apparatus of the Greek New Testament moving forward. First, a note on method. A translation analysis requires a base text against which the translation is compared. The trouble here, of course, lies in the very problem that we are trying to solve. We do not know the exact nature of the Greek text from which the Peshitta was translated. So we must use a hypothesized source text for our comparison and work backwards from there to determine where the translation's actual Vorlage likely differed from the hypothesized one. This process involves judgments on the consistency of the translation technique and is based on the assumption that either the Vorlage will not have differed significantly from the hypothesized text used for comparison, or that any such significant differences will be easily discernible. Thus, for areas in which the translation is inconsistent to a high degree in its relationship to the hypothesized source text, we can conclude that these inconsistencies result from translation technique rather than a significantly different Vorlage. On the other hand, only for areas in which the translation displays high levels of consistency may we be able to attribute discrepancies to a specific difference between the translation's Vorlage and the hypothesized source text. The fact that we have such a large number of Greek New Testament manuscripts strengthens confidence in our ability to posit a hypothetical source text in this way. An example will serve to illustrate this methodology. The Peshitta translator of Colossians is very inconsistent in using the conjunction wow to represent Greek kai. A wow in the Peshitta text correlates to a kai in the Greek text of NA28 almost as many times as a wow appears where there is no kai at all. While it is very likely that the Vorlage did indeed contain some of these extra conjunctions, the translation is simply too inconsistent to conclude that a kai was present in the Vorlage in all of those places. Nor can we therefore cite with confidence the inclusion of a wow in the Peshitta text as evidence for a kai in its Vorlage. On the other hand, the conjunction af in the Peshitta correlates to kai in the Greek text 90% of the time in Colossians and a broader sampling of the Pauline corpus. The evident consistency in this aspect of translation, therefore, means that we may confidently cite the Peshitta as a witness to kai anywhere that af appears. For this study, the text of the Peshitta was taken from the Syriac New Testament volume in the IGNTP series, edited by Aland and Ugal. The hypothesized source text used for comparison is the Greek text and critical apparatus of the NA28. In the verse-by-verse analysis of these two texts, extensive notations were made tracking and describing both what I call the macro and micro elements of the translator's technique. The macro analysis tracked the size of the translation unit, faithfulness to Greek word order, and the degree of literalness. The micro-analysis measured methods for translating verbs, pronouns, prepositional phrases, particles and conjunctions, and consistency in word choice. These tendencies were then tabulated in order to quantify the translation's consistency within each category. Since the standard for citing versional evidence is so high, the consistency of the translation was considered sufficient to potentially witness to a difference in its Vorlage if it translated a category the same way in or approaching 90% of occurrences. Thus, in reference to the previous example of conjunctions witnessing to kai, the usage of wow is deemed inconsistent, while the usage of af is considered sufficiently consistent to provide reliable witness to the presence of kai in its Greek source text. With this methodology in hand, we may now summarize some of the findings of the translation technique analysis and discuss their bearing on the witness of Peshitta Colossians to its underlying Greek text. The translation unit is typically the size of a Greek word or phrase. The translator clearly prefers to maintain the word order of the Greek where possible, almost never displacing full phrases from their position in the Greek sentence. And here's an example for you to view. Word order usually only deviates, thus producing slightly longer translation units in predictable instances where the translator exhibits a preference for the natural Syriac syntax, or where Greek syntax is not transferable because of the lack of a case system in Syriac. Because of the smallness of the translation unit and the general adherence to the Greek order of phrases, it is usually quite simple to discern which Greek element each Syriac element is translating. And deviations are often easily attributable to difficulties on the part of Syriac idiom in representing particular aspects of Greek syntax. Generally speaking, this bodes well for our ability to discern the translation's underlying Greek text. However, it is important to note that the smallness of the translation unit does not mean that the translator only read and worked at this granular level, which means that we as textual critics cannot either. There is evidence to suggest that the translator was reading and understanding his source text in a larger frame, and that his consciousness of the broader context and its meaning influenced translation decisions even in these smaller units. The translator often clarifies or emphasizes something that is implicit in the Greek syntax, and even sometimes takes a stand on one or multiple interpretive possibilities, or an interpretation that is not self-evident at the syntactical level in the Greek. The clearest example of this phenomenon is in chapter 3, verses 8 through 13, which you can see on your screen now. Here the Greek has 3 imperatives, each followed by several subordinate participles. The translator, though, has apparently latched on to the imperatival tone and formalized it, so that every verb in this passage directed at the letter's recipients is translated imperatively, even those Greek participles. You notice that the aorist Greek verbs are translated as finite participles, and the present tense Greek verbs are translated with the imperatival force of a hua and a participle. Here is a clear indication of why translation studies are so important for textual criticism. If, hypothetically, there was a variant reading that had one of those Greek participles as an imperative, one might be tempted to cite the Peshitta as a witness to that variant. But with an understanding of this aspect of the translator's technique, we can see that the imperatives in this passage of the Peshitta are more likely to have arisen from the translator's reading of the text than from an actual variant in the Vorlage. For the sake of time, I will not list the full results of the macro analysis, though I would be happy to share the data personally if anyone was interested. Instead, we may now move on to observe how the analysis calls into question several citations of the Peshitta in the critical apparatus of the NA28. 4 times, the Peshitta is cited in support of a reading of some variation of Kyrios, Jesus, and Christos. Of these, 3 are problematic. Twice it is claimed as a witness to Christos Jesus against Christos, that's in 1:2 and 1:28, and once as a witness to Kyrios Jesus Christos against Kyrios Jesus in 3:17. These citations are spurious not only because of the significant variance in the Greek manuscript tradition and Syriac translation of these titles relating to Jesus, but even more so because of a tendency I found in the Peshitta Pauline corpus to expand upon these titles for Jesus. In 16 instances, which are on your screen for reference now, the text of the NA28, with little to no variation in the Greek manuscript tradition, has fewer of these titular elements than the Peshitta translation does, meaning that an expanded title for Christ in the Peshitta is not reliable evidence to the same title in its Vorlage. As a counterexample, there's a citation in Colossians 4:12 that claims the Peshitta as witness to Christos against Christos Jesus. That is probably valid, at least from the point of view of translation technique, because the Peshitta does not demonstrate a tendency to leave out these titular elements that are present in its Vorlage. The translation technique regarding pronouns, specifically the demonstrable tendency of Peshitta translators to add pronominal suffixes in context of inherent possession or relationship, calls 2 citations into question. In Colossians 3:18 and 19, the NA28 cites the Peshitta as a witness to the inclusion of humon after andrasin and gunaikos, respectively. The Peshitta does have a second person pronominal suffix in both of these places, but it also includes one in the next verse, where none is apparently present in the Greek, reading, "Children, obey your parents." The critical apparatus makes no mention of this, presumably because of the lack of corresponding evidence in the Greek manuscript tradition. One could argue that this third pronominal suffix was added by the translator, either intentionally or accidentally, to parallel the first 2. However, due to the tendency in the Peshitta to add possessive pronominal suffixes in instances of implicit familial relationships, one cannot assume that a pronominal suffix in such a context is necessarily indicative of a corresponding pronoun in the Vorlage. That the Peshitta adds a pronominal suffix in the same context in verse 20 without any Greek manuscript evidence lends credence to this. Next, the NA28 includes 3 dubious citations of the Peshitta in support of an added chi. Those are in 1.6, 3.11, and 3.16. As we noted earlier, the presence of a wow in the Peshitta Colossians only correlates to chi in the Greek text barely more than half the time. So any citation of the Peshitta for chi is questionable to begin with. That these 3 instances occur in the context of longer lists makes the citation even more problematic. In 1.6, the Peshitta translator is likely influenced to add a wow by the abundance of Greek conjunctions in the surrounding context of a pair of verbs separated by chi. In 3.11, the Peshitta has a wow between each of 4 pairs, of which 2 have a chi in the NA28 Greek text, and 1 is cited for a variant inclusion of chi. But the Peshitta has a wow between all 4 of these pairs, so we can't say confidently that any of them witness to chi in the Vorlage, since it is theoretically equally as likely that these conjunctions were added by the translator. Similarly, the Peshitta is cited in 3.16 as a witness for 2 added chi within a list. But again, we cannot conclude that the presence of wow in the Peshitta correlates to a chi in its Vorlage, especially in contexts such as this, where the translator demonstrates the tendency to add conjunctions within lists. A corroborating example is the list in 3.5, where the Peshitta adds a wow between each item with no apparent supporting evidence from the Greek manuscript tradition. And finally, we may address 2 further spurious citations that evoke another crucial issue in citing versional evidence: the use of a concordance to check the consistency of a translation throughout the New Testament. In Colossians 3.17, the NA28 cites the Peshitta as a witness to theopatri against theokai patri. Now, the inconsistent handling of conjunctions in the Peshitta already places this citation on shaky footing. But moreover, checking the concordance reveals that the phrase God and Father, or Allah wa Ava in Syriac, never appears as such in the canon of the Peshitta, even when translating the 14 occurrences of theos kai pater in the Greek. Since the Peshitta never translates this phrase with a conjunction, it definitely should not be considered a witness to the lack of a conjunction in its Vorlage here. Another example in which a simple concordance check clearly negates the citation in the NA28 is Colossians 2.4, where the Peshitta is cited as a witness to metis against medis. In 11 other instances of the Syriac Lanash in the Pauline corpus, it translates metis 3 times, medis 6 times, and udis twice. This phrase, therefore, obviously should not be considered a witness to metis, medis, or udis against each other. In sum, this research demonstrates that attending the translation technique is not only valid in principle, but has tangible consequences for the critical apparatus as it stands. As we think about the citation of versional evidence in the Greek New Testament moving forward, this study of the translation technique in the Peshitta Colossians supports 2 conclusions. First, we must give greater attention to the systematic study of translation technique in the versions of the New Testament. And second, we must either change the way we cite versions or the way we claim to cite them. It is clear that thorough studies of translation technique are necessary to improve our understanding of versional witness to the Greek text. As more work is done on the transmission history of versions and high-quality critical editions are produced, these must be accompanied by studies like this one that clarify how each version's translation technique affects its ability to witness to its Vorlage. It may be the case that the citations of the Peshitta that I found here to be dubious are not particularly important. insofar as none of them are likely to be the deciding factor in a major text critical decision with significant interpretive ramifications. But nevertheless, there are no fewer than 10 citations in the critical apparatus of Colossians in the NA28 that may not actually witness to the Greek reading for which they are claimed. And if that's true of one version in one small epistle, it could very well be true of more versions in more of the New Testament, perhaps even for more important readings. And that is why this study matters for the field of New Testament textual criticism, and that is why more such studies must be undertaken. But even if these studies are never result in a paradigm shift on an exegetically significant text critical decision, they will certainly result in more accurate citations of versional witnesses in the Greek New Testament critical apparatus, and that is a desirable end in its own right. Although the focus of this paper has been admittedly negative, the research itself also positively reinforces our understanding of the Peshitta's witness to its Greek Vorlage. And indeed, it confirmed the legitimacy of about 30 citations of the Peshitta in the NA28 critical apparatus of Colossians. Meanwhile, the 10 citations called into question here are indicative of a need to reevaluate what it means to be confident in a version's underlying Greek text. My argument is never that the Vorlage definitely did not contain the reading for which it is cited, but rather that translation technique is not consistent enough in those places for us to make confident claims about the particularities of the Greek text behind it. So if more studies produce similar results, and we want to maintain the standard that versions are only cited where their underlying Greek text can be determined with confidence, we need to ensure that our citations of versional evidence are not, in fact, overconfident. Therefore, in order to provide more accurate citations and an improved critical apparatus, we must attend more carefully to the translation technique in the New Testament versions. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed for plenty of material. I'm going to unmute everybody to applaud and also to think about the questions which might be asked. So, Christina, I can see you have a hand raised. Please ask away.
Hello, thank you. Thank you very much for this paper. I loved it, just fantastic. I have one comment and one question, actually. I have done, not as extensively as you, I've done some similar observations in Latin text for the Gospel of John, and I found actually a very interesting case where the Syriac text is quoted, and I don't know Syriac at all, I should say that, is quoted to support the reading in the Nestle Aland, and then I looked at the Latin, and the Latin would actually support the reading as well, but it's not quoted. So I think one could take it further, actually, and as you suggest in your last couple of comments, yeah, look at more versional evidence together. That would be very interesting here. So thank you very much for that. But I also have a question. As I said, I don't know any Syriac at all. I was wondering, you said something in the beginning about the Syriac text trying to imitate the Greek word order. And I was wondering how flexible the Syriac language is, or whether the result sounds really rather strange to a native speaker, actually. So yeah, well, I'm sorry for such a basic question, but is it a natural language still, or does it sound awkward?
That's a good question. And the answer is a bit complicated. In the Peshitta, you can tell that the translator is both striving to imitate word order to an extent, but the translator is almost never willing to sacrifice the quality of the translation in order to exactly match the Greek word order. In a later Syriac translation, in the Harklean version, that becomes more concrete. The Harklean translators are trying to imitate almost exactly the Greek word order to the point where it becomes unnatural, and the Syriac idiom is broken down. But in the Peshitta, that is not usually the case. So in the Peshitta, if it comes down to whether the Syriac translator can imitate the Greek word order or produce a phrase that makes sense or sounds right in Syriac, they're going to choose to make the phrase sound correct in Syriac.
Okay. Thank you. Interesting.
Thank you for the question.
Thank you very much. Annetta, you should be unmuted.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Ryne, for your presentation. I'm very glad about it too, like Christina said, and I'm happy to pass it on to Andreas Juckel and his successor, Peter Juhas. I'm glad because you support a tendency which we follow, as Kurt, who is sitting in this meeting too, can tell as well, that we try to be more cautious in quoting the versions for a certain variant, or if we dispense with it. And if you compare the published ECM of Acts and compare it to Nestle Aland, you will see that, especially in those places which you mentioned, like the titulary of Jesus Christ, or small words like Kai, or the addition of personal pronouns, that we tend to not integrate those quotations of versions or of church fathers. And what you suggested, that all the versions work together, as Christina supported, that's what we do every day. So I think we need those people like you who do those field studies and support us in these tendencies. So thank you. It's not an actual question. It's yeah, I'm just grateful.
Thank you.
Thank you, Annetta, and thank you again, Ryne. Jeff, I gather you have you're next in line.
Thank you, Hugh, and thank you, Ryne, for the paper. Given the questions we've had so far, it might be good if someone who does know some Syriac asked a question. I might have forgotten most of my Syriac, but let me have a try. I'm used to this argument in another place because most of my work's been on Old Testament rather than New, and the use of the Syriac becomes especially important in books like Isaiah and really any book of the Old Testament because of the importance of the Syro-hexapla. But there, it might be a different question in a way, because quite often you get Syriac where you've got no Greek. And so it doesn't become a matter of just comparing Greek variants with the Syriac and making a decision between them, but reading the Syriac and deciding what the Greek Vorlage had, which you may not have. So that prompts a question to me, which may not apply to the Pauline corpus, but I'd be interested in your response. Is there anywhere where you've met Syriac which you think represents a Greek that you don't have?
In my complete study of Colossians, there's only one instance where I found a Syriac text that looked like it may witness to a Greek text that is no longer present in the manuscript tradition. And the reason that I'm being so cautious about saying that is because when you're talking about sort of retroverting the Syriac to its underlying Greek, you can't do that in really small specificity unless you have a broad range of witnesses where the Syriac is consistently translating a Greek construction in only one way. And so there was one place in Colossians where, and it was a reflexive pronoun. It had to do with the way that Syriac translated alelon and the way that it translated eautus. And even then, I am cautious in saying that the Syriac witnesses to a Greek that we no longer have, because I didn't find 100% consistency in the Syriac New Testament relating to the translation of those phrases in the Greek. So I'm usually very cautious when it comes to that, because without a high degree of consistency, it's just hard to know for sure it's hard to know for sure exactly what is behind a Syriac text.
Well, on that note of caution then, unless Jan wishes to speak to the comment he's offered about the Syriac, no? I think we've reached the point that this is the end of today's session. So